Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Sophie Lees, and today I'm here to talk to you about colonialism, you and your students. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that this is the land of the Islander people and pay my respects to any Indigenous people here with us today. So today I'm here to talk to you about European colonialism, its impacts and ongoing nature, the importance of teachers understanding colonialism and what this understanding means for our pedagogy, and I'll also be discussing the importance of meaningfully integrating Indigenous content into our teaching. As McNaughton and Davis assert, colonialism is the economic and cultural oppression and exploitation, a system of control that resulted from European expansion. Larkin asserts that the settler-colonial dynamic was one of domination, where political and economic power had been structured to continue the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. As Hampton and Toombs assert, the colonial process was rooted in the dispossession of lands, which resulted in Indigenous peoples' isolation from their economic base and their spiritual life. As Shannon asserts, policies such as protection and assimilation were part of the colonial project and were a system of powerful control over Indigenous peoples. From the perspectives of policymakers, many of these policies were introduced because they thought Indigenous people were dying out, and these policies would smooth the dying pillow, as it was termed. I'd just like to draw your attention to this image of the Secret River by Kate Grenville, which vividly and powerfully demonstrates the violence of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationship. So, what are the impacts of colonialism? This image of Belle really does point to the lived reality and negative experiences brought by colonialism, such as racism in our society. As Ty McCain Maple illustrate, colonialism has taken and continues to take its toll on the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Hampton and Toombs assert that colonial dominance has caused a severe disempowerment and dispossession from land, having implications for self-esteem and well-being amongst Indigenous peoples. Parker illustrates that colonial practices led to psychological distress, spiritual despair, marginalisation, and poverty. As Ty McCain Maple illustrate, also intergenerational trauma and continuing cycles of violence and loss. Milroy has coined the term malignant grief in order to describe the cumulative, collective, and irresolvable grief that affects some Indigenous people because of the colonial past. Additionally, Shizweki illustrates the continued racism in our society, which continues to bar Indigenous participation in society. Trauma also represents an impact of colonialism. As Atkinson asserts, the experiences of disease, violence, starvation, and death are shared by individuals and the collective. Today, trauma from past events remains in the hearts, minds, and souls of Indigenous people. According to Atkinson, trauma has meant that Indigenous people experienced change in mindsets as they felt fear, anger, anxiety, and depression. Alcohol drinking became a coping mechanism for some Indigenous people, and the resulting violence led to further traumatization. As McCown and Strakosch illustrate, colonialism is an ongoing reality for Indigenous people, manifesting in colonial structures such as racism and discrimination. So why is it important for teachers to understand this event? We need to be able to prepare students for life in society, to discontinue colonialism, and to be adequately equipped to teach Indigenous students. We need to recognise our influence as teachers on the minds of children and conversely society. I'd just like to point to this artwork by Vernon Archie, which points to the systemic racism in our society and really is a talking point for our role as teachers in stopping colonialism in its tracks. Madison asserts that through an understanding of colonialism and recognition of past injuries, it enables us to rewrite aspects of history and reshape our present. Rose asserts that as educators, it is incredibly damaging if through our teaching we further colonial discourses and support the ignorance of Indigenous issues. This ignorance then replicates itself into a vicious cycle and the continuation of silent apartheid. According to Vass, it is this uncritical production and reproduction of knowledge that sustains colonialism. As Madison asserts, we need to prepare students to be adequate citizens and well-informed voters. Reynolds illustrates that many non-Indigenous Australians feel silenced by their lack of knowledge of Indigenous issues. As teachers, we need to adequately prepare students for serious engagement in Indigenous issues. As Lyle Younger, Potter and Craven assert, a limited education on Indigenous issues and perspectives limits the opportunities for students to challenge and overcome racism in society. Madison illustrates that an understanding of colonialism is important for the path towards reconciliation, as through education about the true nature of our history, the divide and the violence, reconciliation can be achieved. As Stewart asserts, an understanding of colonialism is also important for supporting Indigenous students in our classes. By continuing to trivialise Indigenous knowledge and furthering mysteries and stereotypes, we marginalise Indigenous students and limit their educational success. Colonialism also helps us understand our own cultural bias. As Ship asserts, it is important that we recognise this cultural bias present within ourselves, our classrooms, and our curriculum. As Chisholm asserts, a lack of awareness or sensitivity of this cultural bias can perpetuate stereotypes and diminish Indigenous students' opportunities for academic success. So how does this impact our pedagogy? Importantly, we need to move away from teaching that trivialises Indigenous perspectives and gives students authentic information about Australia's history. Teach them to think critically about information and embed Indigenous perspectives and content into our teaching. An understanding of colonialism demands the integration of critical thinking skills into our teaching. As Munro et al. Assert, this is due to the ongoing nature of colonialism and the need for us to be able to deconstruct and question colonial discourses. We need to meaningfully embed Indigenous perspectives into learning. As Kanu illustrates, the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives supports students to develop respect and understanding of Indigenous histories, cultures, and contemporary lifestyles, whilst also allowing students to critically examine their history, discrimination, and their own position in society. As McLaughlin and Watman assert, there exists a perception that Indigenous knowledge is irrelevant and removed from everyday Australian experiences. However, it enhances students' educational experiences. As Ray asserts, studying Indigenous content has benefits for students due to their authenticity of learning experiences. Ray illustrates that such learning allows for meaningful exchanges of life histories and experiences and allows for exploration into Indigenous history and contemporary issues. Nakata illustrates that we need to embed Indigenous perspectives across all our subjects, from maths to history. An example of Indigenous knowledge inclusion might be the use of Indigenous resources when discussing science, or including resources on Manguk when teaching sport. As Nakata asserts, by including Indigenous knowledge, we insert into students' thinking a different way of understanding contemporary Indigenous presence. Nakata illustrates that teachers need to be thinking about when it is critical to embed Indigenous perspectives into teaching. An example of this might be the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives when examining Anzac or the impact of the stolen generations on Indigenous people. I'd just like to respond to this quote on Indigenous education. If we limit Indigenous education to dance, drop paintings and annual events, we further the colonial views of Indigenous peoples, and racism persists. Misconceptions and untruths about Indigenous peoples are furthered. According to McNaughton, as Morrison asserts, such understandings trivialise Indigenous culture and further the understanding of Aboriginal people as the man on the $2 coin. As Rose asserts, this works to replicate ignorance, which then continues in a vicious cycle. These sorts of activities create understandings in children of Aboriginal people as belonging to the past, practising exotic lifestyles and the othering of Indigenous people, according to McNaughton and Davis. I'd like to draw your attention to this artwork by Christopher Pease, which challenges Europeans' depiction of Indigenous people and dismantles the concept of the noble savage. This colonial understanding includes the idea that Indigenous Australians can be homogenised into a collective they, which is distinct from the cultural mainstream. This represents the process of othering, as Aboriginal people are positioned as different from the mainstream and the binary between us and them is furthered. As Nkapoto illustrates, such acts highlight the difference of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems caused by misconceptions about Indigenous knowledge. Aboriginality is only being limited to cultural items and acts. As a result of the silent apartheid and the colonisation of the mind, Indigenous cultures, worldviews and histories are dismissed as irrelevant and unimportant. According to Craven, this lack of meaningful knowledge in which misconceptions and stereotypes are generated mean that Indigenous Australians have not been empowered to challenge and overcome racism in society. To summarise, I have discussed the damaging and ongoing nature of European colonialism and the impact on Indigenous Australians. I have stressed the importance of teacher understanding colonialism and the importance of including meaningful Indigenous perspectives and content into our teaching. I'd like to conclude by echoing Rose's sentiment, who asserts that as teachers we are privileged and we have a great opportunity to make a difference in the lives of students, and we can contribute to a better society by deconstructing colonial discourses and challenging our students' views with Indigenous perspectives. Thank you.